I'll say this now because I might forget to say it. And, when I was thinking about how long it might take to go through Esther, I was remembering I spent a whole semester, 3 hours a day, every day, Monday through Friday, working my way through Esther, one Hebrew word at a time. In reality, in English, it's 10 chapters, and we may well either finish tonight or next week. But what I'm thinking is the remaining, before we take our break for, leading up to Thanksgiving, I have a couple of other things in mind, kind of one-off sessions, one on Ruth, one on Samson, and one on Gideon. And so that's what I'm thinking, that if we finish, because we may well finish the story of Esther tonight, because we made pretty good headway last week and got up through the end of chapter 3, but a lot of it goes pretty quickly after that, because I kind of already did some of the background. So we'll see how far we can get without going too fast. But since my watch says we've got a couple minutes after, welcome everyone in the sanctuary, welcome folks online on YouTube and or Facebook, etc. We are looking through the book of Esther in the Old Testament. The recap being, this is a story that takes place during the time when there was a Jewish population in the Persian Empire under Xerxes, the pretty famous Persian emperor. And it was during that time of Xerxes that the Persian Empire had conquered the Babylonian Empire. Many of the Jews who'd been captured and brought back as slaves into the Babylonian Empire under Persian rule were allowed to go back to Jerusalem, go back to Judea, rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, eventually rebuild the temple. But many Jews remained in the Persian Empire. They didn't go back. They had settled down into that over 2 or 3 generations. And so this takes place, a Jewish population in the Persian Empire. When we say Persia, as I say, we're talking about today, we would call it Iran. And we learned last week that Xerxes, who history tells us, not just the Bible, but history tells us was a very temperamental, emotional, he would sometimes change his mind on a dime, a powerful ruler, but also just kind of crazy in some ways. And his wife, Vashti, his queen, refused to come in and show off her beauty and jewels to the stag party that he was hosting and the all-male party he was hosting. And since she refused to come in, he decided to depose her as queen, have a royal beauty pageant at the suggestion of his leadership to pick a new queen, and the queen would be the first among the many women that were part of his harem. They do a search throughout the entire empire for the most beautiful young virgins, one of whom is Esther, a young Jewish woman who'd been raised by her cousin, Mordecai. She not only is chosen to be a part of the beauty contest, she is chosen to be the new queen and reaches that place. And then where the story gets complicated is her cousin Mordecai sits at the city gate to kind of see what's going to happen with his young cousin that he's raised as a daughter. There arises a advisor to Xerxes by the name of Haman, that when he goes in and out of the palace, everyone bows before him as the number 2 man in the kingdom. Mordecai, however, will not bow down to this man Haman. And Haman, it is obvious that there's one person who won't bow to him, and that's this Jew, Mordecai. And so Haman is so enraged by this, what he perceives as a lack of respect, that he goes to Xerxes and says, there is a certain people among us that are different from us. They're weird. They have weird customs. They're not like us. And they're a threat to us, and I think we should kill all of them. And I'd like you to issue a decree that we kill all of them on a certain day. And Xerxes, not even probing, well, what are they called? What people are we talking about? Xerxes just accedes and says, okay, yeah, you do that. And Haman then has this idea he's going to exterminate not just Mordecai, but all of his people, all of the Jewish people. And this edict is sent out that there is going to be a day in which all the Jews in the kingdom will be executed. And that is of dire news, of course, to the Jews, and Mordecai takes this very heavily. So we got up through the end of chapter 3 with this decree that on this particular day that was chosen by the casting of a pur, which is like a dice, or mini pur, purim being the plural of pur, that this day was chosen to be the doomsday, the execution day for all the Jews in the kingdom of Persia. And all because this one man, Haman, has this insatiable need for revenge against the feeling that this one man has slighted him and refused to bow to him. We're also, of course, told that when Esther is chosen as the new queen, her uncle, her cousin, who is like a father, has told her, don't reveal that you're a Jew. Don't let them know you're a Jew, because they, as a minority, felt like this possible persecution was definitely a reality. So they kept, he said, keep your identity as a Jew secret. So Xerxes doesn't realize that his queen is now Jewish. He doesn't realize that the people that Haman has convinced him to exterminate are the Jews. He just has been told they're this weird group in our kingdom that are troublemakers, and they're different from us, and they have weird customs, and we need to get rid of them. So that's where the plot has proceeded. The one other thing I told you to remember last week is that as Mordecai was hanging around the gate, he became aware of an assassination plot against the king, against Xerxes. He reported it to Esther, and Esther reported it to the proper authorities, and the men were arrested, the conspirators, and hanged or executed. And they recorded the incident in the royal annals. They recorded this incident. These men, there was a conspiracy. It was discovered by this Mordecai. It was reported. It was caught before they could harm the king, etc., etc. That was put in a book to have a record of that incident. And that's going to come and become an important part of the story. So, where we left it at the end of chapter 3, the edict has gone out that on a certain day, all Jews in the Persian Empire are going to be executed. So we pick it up with Esther chapter 4. Esther chapter 4. It says, when Mordecai learned, chapter 4, verse 1, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, in other words, this edict being sent out, he tore his clothes, he put on sackcloth and ashes, went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. And if you remember some other Bible stories, especially in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, this is a traditional way that the Jews, especially in ancient times, when they heard horrible news, would rip their clothing. It was a sign of grief and distress and despair to rip your clothes when you heard, a relative of yours has died, or some other terrible news. You rip your clothes. They also would say, they would put on, they say, sackcloth and ashes. Sackcloth being mourning clothes, and literally put ashes on their head as a sign of mourning. In a way, our Christian tradition of Ash Wednesday is connected to that ashes are a sign of repentance or mourning or sorrow or something like that. So Mordecai has this response of ripping his clothes, putting on the mourning clothes, putting ashes on his head. And you see this in other Old Testament stories, and even when in the scene in the Sanhedrin, when Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin and the high priest, and he says, I demand that you tell me, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus replies, I am. And it says at that point the high priest ripped his clothes at the blasphemy that he had just heard from Jesus. So this tradition of ripping your clothes as a sign of either grief or shock or sorrow or anger or whatever is carried through in many Bible stories. So, wailing loudly and bitterly. Verse 2. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. You couldn't go around inside the palace gates dressed like that. In every province to which the edict and the order of the king came, the edict that the Jews are going to be killed, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So all throughout the kingdom, it's even like, it's not like they come and kill them. It's like, on this day you're going to be killed. So there's time to, say your prayers, but you're going to die. I mean, you think about, okay, we got this much time before they're going to come and murder us. And so they're having this time of bitter mourning and wailing. It says, when Esther's maids, verse 4, when Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of the sackcloth, which was like, well, don't do that. Here, put on some nice clothes, which is like showing maybe she didn't quite grasp the gravity of the situation at that point. He wouldn't accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, who was one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her. Remember, eunuchs, castrated men who were in charge of the harems. They're castrated for safety reasons. Ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So she doesn't know exactly what's going on here. Why is Mordecai so upset? Why are the Jewish people upset? She's isolated really inside of the palace, and this news has not apparently gotten to her. So Hathach, this eunuch, went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Remember, when Haman goes to the king, he says, not only do I think you should destroy them, I will pay to have them destroyed, to have them killed. At which Xerxes is like, keep your money, you don't have to pay me. But the effort of, I'll even pay for it. He also gave him a copy of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, one of the capitals of the empire, to show to Esther and explain it to her. He told him to urge her to go into the king's presence and beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. So Mordecai is like, Esther, you are in a position of power and authority now. You're the queen. I know I've told you in the past not to reveal that you're Jewish, but now is the time for you to go in and reveal that you're Jewish and that there's this edict to kill your people, and you need to go plead with the king, your husband. You need to go plead with the king for the life of your people. You need to go into his chamber, go into the throne room, and make a plea. So Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, this is her message back, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. And this sounds paranoid and crazy, but you think about it, okay. Assassination plots were common. They always have been. Xerxes, there was something for a king to have an air of, not just anybody can come and talk to me. Not just anybody can walk into my throne room and, you have to be summoned. You have to be given an appointment. You have to be, I have to want to see you for you to come into my presence. And so that kept anybody from just walking in to where he was. And there were literally men with, swords or axes or whatever, stationed that if somebody tried to walk in without being summoned, they would kill them. And she says, you know the rule. Nobody can go in there unless he calls for you. And she says, he hasn't called for me in a month. What you think? You remember he was so enamored of her, he chose her of all the women to be the queen. But, again, this is kind of a PG story. He has a whole harem. And he hasn't called for her to his chamber or to his bed for a month. She said, I can't just barge in there. I can't just walk in there without him summoning me. Maybe I've fallen out of favor. Maybe he's bored with me. I can't just walk in there. Verse 12, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. And if there's one key verse in the entire book, in the entire story, that is the key verse. That's the key sentence. How do you know that you're being where you are at that time, at that place, with that crown, with that access? How do you know that you are not there for such a time as this? Now, I said this book, the book of Esther, is unique in the 66 books of the Bible. It's the only book in the Bible that never mentions the name of God. The name God or Lord or Jehovah or Yahweh is never mentioned in the book. But, scholars would say that is actually intentional. God is all over the book, but the point of the story is that things that can be marked off as coincidence often are not coincidence. That Esther is in this place at this time for such a time as this, and that her being there is no accident. That, as he says, who knows? But you've come to this for such a time as this. In other words, in the big mystery of the universe, and really the mystery of how God acts in the world, how do you know that you were not put in this position precisely for this moment in time, for this moment? And I think that, that sentence has a lot to do with our culture and our time. Because, we haven't seen the parting of the Red Sea. We don't see the kind of miracles that we sometimes read about in the scriptures. And so there are people who say, well, I haven't seen any evidence of God. I haven't ever seen a miracle of God. But often, we see things happen and you say, well, is that really a coincidence? Or did that happen because God was at work, even if we maybe don't exactly understand the how and the where and the how and the why, and that maybe God is sometimes working sort of behind the scenes and we don't always realize it until we go, that was a crazy coincidence. Well, maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe it was something more. So that's really the focus of this story, because I said there's going to be a series of events. The dominoes have to fall a certain way. Vashti, the queen, has to get deposed. There has to be a royal beauty contest, which Esther wins. I mean, we start seeing these things these coincidences start falling that puts her in the position that she's in. And we're going to see that this is not the last coincidence that happens here. So he says, how do you know that you are not exactly where you are right now for such a time as this? So verse verse 15. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. And fasting always implies praying as well. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. In other words, it's a risk, but, you're right. I am here to save my people, and that's what I'm going to do. And if it costs me my life, well, so be it. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions, which is an interesting little sentence, because up until this point, it is Mordecai giving her instruction. Now, she's giving him instruction. There's a little bit of the power shift from Mordecai telling Esther what to do to Esther telling Mordecai what to do. She's sort of embracing her role and the power that she has as the queen. So, how is she going to go about this? Does she run in and say, Xerxes, I'm a Jew, and Haman wants to kill my people, and you got to do something about it? No, she doesn't do that. She knows Xerxes, by this time, even if she hadn't been there in a month, she has got an understanding of how Xerxes thinks. And, he's somebody you have to kind of warm up, maybe would be the rest word. One of the things I was reading this week was about, Xerxes, things we know from him from history, as I say, outside of the Bible, just things we know about Xerxes. We know historical accounts of him because he's a well-known Persian king, Xerxes. When he had ordered a bridge built that was destroyed by a storm, and because a storm, the sea, wiped this bridge away, he ordered his men to give the sea 300 lashes. In other words, the sea knocked down my bridge. Go punish the sea. Which kind of says, maybe he had his understanding of, and he had all the bridge builders executed as well. All the men who built the bridge, he had them all killed. One of his loyal subjects gave him a whole bunch of money for a military expedition. And Xerxes was so pleased with this man stepping up and giving him money for this military expedition that Xerxes returned the money to the man and then gave him more money on top of it for his loyalty. And because of that, this man asked that one of his sons be exempt from the draft and going into battle. And that made Xerxes so mad that he ordered that particular son cut into pieces. So you see how his that's not biblical stuff. That's from other historical sources. This is how Xerxes was maybe unstable might not be the right word, because he conquered. He conquered much territory. It was only when he tried to invade Greece that he finally met his match. But he was impulsive. He was an egomaniac. He was maybe a little had an exaggerated view of his own power and could change his mind on a dime. And so when Esther's like, I need to see if I can get him to save my people, she doesn't just run in there. She has a plan. She has a plan. So here's how her plan goes. Chapter 5. On the third day, this is the third day after the fasting and the praying, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So, no drama there, really. Even if she's in the doorway, he's, come on in. So she doesn't face, being executed. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given to you." Is he serious there? No. This is a Middle Eastern way of talking that we see, especially in more ancient times, but maybe even in more modern times. It is a Middle Eastern exaggeration. A king might say to somebody loyal, "Ask me for anything." He doesn't really mean anything. And the person knows not to ask for certain things. I mean, it's a delicate, when he says, "Ask me for anything," he doesn't really mean anything. If you said, "Well, can I have your crown?" I mean, he'd say, "All right, off with your head." I mean, anything doesn't mean anything, and half the kingdom doesn't really mean half the kingdom. It's like, I'm feeling generous, I am beneficent, what's your request? It's kind of, but again, it reminds us that sometimes, I can think of another king, quite a bit after this, King Herod, not Herod the Great, but his son, who his stepdaughter does a provocative dance for him, and he says, "What do you want, my dear? Just name it. I'll give you whatever you want." And she says, "I want the head of John the Baptist." If you remember that. And he, in front of his guests and in front of everybody else, is like, I don't want to do that, but I can't. I already said, "What do you want?" And now I have to save face and give her what she's asked for. So he orders John to be beheaded. So this is the kind of conversations that go on, between a king and a person that is asking for a favor. So he says, "What do you want?" "If it pleases the king," 5:4, "if it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for them." All I want is you to come to my banquet and bring your prime minister, bring Haman with you. And bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asked. It's like, well, that's not a very big request. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now, what's your petition? It'll be given to you. What's your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it'll be granted." In other words, I know this isn't really what you want. I know this is the warm-up. What do you really want? Tell me what you want, what you really, really want. The Spice Girl reference. Some of you get. So Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I'll prepare for them." In other words, come to another banquet. "Then I will answer the king's question." In other words, come tomorrow, we'll have another banquet, and then I'll tell you what I really want. And so, okay. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. Haman is like, I mean, he's in tight with the king and the queen. I mean, his ego is even more inflated than it was before. He goes out. He's been in this special, very private banquet with the king and the queen. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. His happy mood disappears when that Mordecai the Jew still will not bow down to him. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above all the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she's invited me along with the king tomorrow. I'm obviously the king's favorite. I'm obviously flying high. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. All of this great things, still that one thing, that one old guy who won't bow to him, galls him so much that he cannot enjoy his good fortune. All the other good stuff, he can't be happy because that one guy won't bow down to him. His wife, Zeresh, and all his friends said to him, have a gallows built 75 feet high, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. It's like, yes, then I can be happy if I hang Mordecai, and not just on any old gallows, a 75-foot high gallows. Everybody in town will be able to see him hanging there from this high gallows. And then I can finally be happy. Now, meanwhile, that night, the king couldn't sleep. The king couldn't sleep, so he took a Sominex. No, didn't have that. Didn't have a pill to take. The king couldn't sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. In other words, read me something boring. Read me the annals of the kingdom, and that'll put me to sleep. Or to somebody to come in and read to him from the annals of the kingdom. So they go find the annals of the kingdom. So, it was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Remember I said, remember that? That not only did they do that, but they wrote it down. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Well, nothing's been done for him, his attendants said. Well, the king said, who's in the court? Now, Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he'd erected for him. The attendant said, well, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for a man the king delights to honor? Now, Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, well, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Don't neglect anything you have recommended. You see, he's like, oh, he's talking about me. I know he's talking about me. So he thinks of the most grand gesture he can imagine, picturing himself being paraded through the streets in a royal robe and with someone crying in front of the horse. Here is a man the king delights to honor. And this is one of those, you can almost see this played out on a stage because, as we're watching this story and we're seeing this story unfold, and we know we know what Haman doesn't know. We know the king is wanting to honor Mordecai, but Haman doesn't know that. And so they're having this conversation, and they're talking about two separate things. Haman thinks he's talking about him, but of course the king's talking about Mordecai. And so suddenly it all gets reversed. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai, led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." So instead of being lifted up, now Mordecai is being forced to honor his hated enemy. He is being forced to do this for the man he despises. That 5 minutes earlier, he was going to ask the king to hang. Afterwards, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Mordecai rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh's wife and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you can't stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Again, there's a hint here. What is his wife thinking? What does Mordecai have? Mordecai has this God. Mordecai has this God. The Jewish people have this Yahweh, this Jehovah, this God. And his wife is saying, uh-oh, this is not looking good, my husband. While they were still talking to him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So now this is the second banquet. Haman is now going to the second banquet that Esther has prepared. So it's, again, just the three of them. Xerxes, Esther, and Haman. Chapter 7. So, the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It'll be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." He's asked her this now 3 times. Tell me what you want, and I'll give it to you. I'll grant your request. Just tell me what you really want. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." He's thinking she's going to ask for, jewels or, more maids or more, who knows what he's picturing that she would want from him. She says, "Well, what I want is my own life and the life of my people, because there is one who has plotted my death and the death of all of my people." Now, if the plot was just to enslave us, I wouldn't have bothered you. That wouldn't have been that would have been too trivial to bring to your attention, to interrupt your busy schedule. But this is about my life and the life of my people, because we are scheduled for annihilation. King Xerxes 7:5. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing?" And now, finally, she shows her cards. The adversary and the enemy is this vile Haman. And this is the moment where you see all the blood run out of his face as he starts to put the pieces together. Oh my goodness, she's Jewish. she's Jewish. The piece of information he didn't have. She's Jewish. He hadn't counted on that. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. He's like, oh, you can't, the whole thing is just more than he can even take in at that point. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. The king gets up, he's stomping around, he's so angry, and he leaves the room for a minute, and Haman, snivelly Haman, now is begging Esther to spare his life. Oh, queen, I didn't know you were Jewish. Oh, I never would have, oh, please spare me. The king, just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she's with me in the house? In other words, not only you were going to kill her, now you're going to rape her? His anger is now over the top. You're going to attack my wife in my own house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. In other words, this is a face that the king should not have to look upon. Sometimes in these royal things, it was like, instead of just saying, I want to go visit the king, or let me have an audience with the king, or hey, can I have a meeting with the king? They would say, I want to see the king's face. It was all about seeing somebody's face. It's all about meeting face to face. But now, Haman, they cover his face because the king should not have to look upon the face of such a vile, traitorous man as Haman. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, well, a gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He made it for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. Here's a little helpful information, by the way. There actually is an existing gallows, a really, really, really tall gallows. It's right by Haman's house. He wanted you to have Mordecai, the one who saved you from the assassination attempt. He wanted you to order Mordecai hanged on it. But there's a gallows right outside his house. The king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. That when I say that phrase, at that moment, Haman is hoist on his own petard, if you've heard that expression. The evil he plotted for somebody else now falls upon him. But sadly, in the Middle Eastern way, it's not only going to fall on him. So let's see what happens next. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told him how he was related to her. The king had not put any of this together. The king took off his signet ring. Remember, this is the one that has this thing you can seal royal documents with and all that, which he had reclaimed from Haman before they took him to the gallows, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. So Haman, who, remember, he said he was bragging to his friends, look how wealthy I am, look at all the stuff I've got. All of that now goes to Mordecai. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favor and thinks it's right thing to do, if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall upon my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" Here's where it gets tricky, because if you remember, they said, and this seems again odd to us, they said, once the king issues a decree, you can't just pretend it's not out there. You can't just rescind it. You can overrule it, but you can't just take it back. So she's like, you got to do something, because this decree has gone out all over the empire that this particular day is Kill the Jews Day. Is Murder Your Jewish Neighbor Day. You got to do something about that. King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I've given his estate to Esther, and they've hanged him on the gallows. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you. Seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked." So basically he says, well, yeah, Xerxes still is kind of like, take care of it. Write something up that will solve the problem, and use the ring I gave you to seal it as the king's thing, and get it out there in time to stop the slaughter. At once the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan. They wrote out all the Mordecai's orders to the Jews and the satraps and the governors and the nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Think about that. You've got an empire where you've got all different languages. Not everybody speaks, well, in Iran today they speak Farsi. I'm not sure exactly what language we're talking about, but all these different languages, all the way from India. If you have the map, all the way this vast empire, you got to get 127 provinces, and this is, as I would probably have to tell the little kids, there's no email, there's no phones, there's no Facebook, all these things. It has to be handwritten notices sent out by courier to all these different provinces and towns, and posted for people to read in the town square, the ones that could read, to say, remember that whole order about murdering Jews on this day? Yeah, don't do that. Don't murder the Jews that day. So they have to get in all the different languages. And it says, these orders are blah, 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 blah. Mordecai wrote in the name of the king, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, sent them to mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king had messenger horses that were like, Pony Express or whatever. They're the fast horses to get the word out to the provinces. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force or any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and their children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. Because, you think about this, this wasn't so much a Xerxes' army is going to go out there and exterminate the Jews. It's more like an order went out that on this day, it's open season on the Jews. Kill them, take their stuff, no consequence or penalty. Just go out there. If you have a Jew in your neighborhood or in your town, kill them, take their stuff. And you get free, don't pass go, don't get out of jail free card for that. You're not going to have any consequence for killing Jews that day. So the order goes out to the Jews. You can arm yourself, defend yourself, and is telling the people who are thinking about it, I'm going to kill that guy and take his stuff. They might kill you first if you try that. And they'll take your stuff if you try it. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month in the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, but the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. couriers riding the royal horses, the fast horses, the race horses, raced around, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued also in the citadel of Susa, which is one of the three capitals of the Persian Empire at the time. Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments, blue and white, a large crown of gold, a purple robe of fine linen. The city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. So I'm not sure that's the best way to evangelize, proselytize, but this became people who actually converted to Judaism because of this. And the rest of this is kind of a mop-up of it, but let's keep going because we don't have a whole lot more to go. On the 13th day of the 12th month, in the month of Adar, you notice they're very focused on what day these things occurred. This is because like most things in the Old Testament, this was not written the day after the events happened. This is written probably generations after these events, when this celebration had already become a tradition among Jewish people, the celebration of Purim, the holiday of Purim. And as I mentioned, this holiday, other Jewish holidays are some of them are very solemn. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. It's a day of fasting. It's a day of mourning. It's a day of self-reflection. Even sort of Jews who don't observe other Jewish customs and things often will observe Yom Kippur as a day of fasting and reflection and seriousness. Passover celebrates, of course, the Exodus, and there is joy, but there's also a remembrance of the suffering and the bondage, and the meal celebrates, or at least is a remembrance of the hardships of the building of the pyramids and the forced labor and all of that. But Purim is a joyous holiday. And it is very much, as I said, often in many synagogues and in many Jewish communities, the way it's celebrated is with a puppet show, acting out the events that we just read about, and when the Haman puppet comes on, boo, when the Esther puppet comes on, yay. I mean, it's a melodrama. It's done in a very comical way. I mean, because you can see when Haman goes in there thinking he's hot stuff, and suddenly he realizes he's, dead meat. There's a certain dark humor in all of that. That the bad guy gets his comeuppance at that moment. So this is how you're going to celebrate Purim. I grew up thinking it was Purim, but it's Purim, as I said. Chapter 9. On the 13th day of the 12th month of the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities and all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those seeking their destruction. So those who had been plotting to kill Jews that day, the Jews maybe you're the one who's going to get attacked that day. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces. He became more and more powerful. So he rises to sort of a second-in-command, prime minister, chief advisor role that had formerly been his enemy, Haman. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. They did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed, and it's got a whole bunch of names I'm not even going to try to do. You notice there's all these names of the enemies of them, but here, verse 10. They killed the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemies of the Jew. But they didn't lay hands on the plunder. So, not only was Haman killed, his sons were killed as well. The number of those slain in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king the same day. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the provinces? Now, what's your petition? It'll be given you. What's your request? It'll be granted. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on gallows. So they're going to suffer the same fate as their father. So the king commanded this be done. The edict was issued. They hanged the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar. They put to death in Susa 300 men, but they didn't lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces, which remember is 127 provinces, also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but they didn't lay hands on the plunder. This is all throughout the vast empire, and how they got that number, I'm not too sure about. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. Maybe it's a little hard for us to combine feasting and joy with murdering your enemies. This would not seem at all strange to the audience that first read this. When you're a persecuted minority, when you are targeted for annihilation, often, when your enemies are killed, there is a joy in that. I mean, we Christians would probably wince at that and say, well, you're not really supposed to rejoice in the death of our enemies. But when you think of this as kill or be killed, it's hard to not understand what's going on there. So here we get now this is going to be celebrated henceforth. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and the 14th. Then on the 15th, they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. But that's why rural Jews, those living in villages, observed the 14th of the month of Adar as the day of feasting, a day of giving presents to each other. So this is an odd little detail that, in the sticks, in the country lands, they didn't get the word quick enough, and they had to wait another day to have their celebration. So, which we think that's an odd little detail to throw in, but anyway. Mordecai recorded these events. He sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and the 15th days of the month of Adar, which, by the way, of course, the Jewish calendar is different from our calendar. There is a whole Jewish calendar. I should have looked this up, what year it is, on the Jewish calendar. It's the year like 5827 or 5942 or something like that. It's getting closer and closer on the Jewish calendar to the year 6000. And the months of the Jewish calendar all have different names. That's observed for ceremonial reasons. Most Jewish people still follow the calendar we do, of course, but there is a Jewish calendar with Jewish months and Jewish years and all that. And that's why Rosh Hashanah is New Year's Day on the Jewish calendar. You have Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, and then the next holiday shortly after that is Rosh Hashanah, which is Jewish New Year. So the Jewish calendar is different, but it's the Jewish calendar that sets the dates of Passover, and it's based on cycles of the moon and all kinds of things, and it almost always lines up with Easter. Like the Jewish festival of Passover and the Christian holiday of Easter, since they did occur historically at the same time, almost always line up at the same time, because as you know, the way you calculate the date of Easter is so baffling, and it has to do with full moons and all kinds of things to calculate the date of Easter. That's just why it's always between the 20th of March and the 20th of April, but it can vary within those two end zones a whole month, depending on the cycles of the moon. Anyway, Mordecai recorded these events, and they're going to celebrate them. Verse 22, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast the poor, that is the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word poor, because of everything written in this letter and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. The Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation, by every family, in every province, every city. And these days of Purim should never cease to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of them die out among their descendants. This is kind of the wrap up, at the end, here's the recap of the whole story, just in case you missed it. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in their 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes, words of goodwill and assurance to establish these days of Purim as their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, as they'd established for themselves and their descendants in regard to the times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim. It was written down in the records. And then this final little, very, very short chapter at the end. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores. And all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king had raised him, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all Jews. So, thus ends the book of Esther. And of course it says, and it was all written down in those annals, and we don't have those annals, like a lot of things we don't have. But as I say, this book was I think it was literally the last book accepted by the Jews as being Scripture, as being worthy or being accepted as part of the canon of Jewish Scripture. There was quite a debate among the rabbis about whether it should be included because it lacks the name of God. But there's a word that we've come to talk about the underlying theme. The word usually is providence. Which is more than just a town in Rhode Island. This word providence is the idea that God is working, as we say, behind the scenes. That God doesn't always do a miracle that is obviously a miracle, like the Red Sea or something like that. That sometimes you see God's hand at work. And somebody who's not a believer could say, well, that's just coincidence, That's just coincidence. But this story has, of course, coincidence after coincidence after coincidence. If he didn't read the book, they couldn't sleep. And, they pull out the book. All those things have to fall in line for all of this to happen. And I think that's why, the Jews eventually accepted this book as a sacred writing. And why then the church, when the church was putting together our scriptures, we accepted the Jews' list of holy books as our Old Testament, and didn't really quibble with that. So, as I said, it didn't take as long to get through this as I thought it might. But we might have time for thoughts, questions, comments about maybe not just this book, but about the whole larger issue of providence or the issue of the persecution of the Jewish people throughout history? I mean, anybody thoughts about that, or things that this seems to resonate with other parts of history? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, I think as you talk about, those things that somebody being in the right place at the right time. Now, I think, we're always, anytime you discuss providence, we kind of get into, well, do we really have free will? Because, do we really make choices, or is God up there just as a puppet master? And I think as people who are Wesleyan, and I'm a Wesleyan through and through, who, in other words, I believe in free will. I don't believe God has preordained everybody's life. I don't think God has written a script that we are ordained or preordained or predestined to follow. Predestination is a concept some Christians have, although I don't think it's as popular as it once was. Christians used to argue about that. Calvinists versus usually what are called Arminians. John Calvin, a Christian who really taught that everything is predetermined, predestined. And Jacob Arminius said, no, we really do have free will. God is not just pulling the strings. We're more than puppets. We truly do have free will. So I believe we do have free will, but I do think sometimes God is helping things along, I guess, as you say, putting people in our path, putting people in a situation like in this story that God, Esther still had to decide to act. Even though he put her there, she had to make the decision, am I going to risk my life and walk into the king? He didn't take away her free will, but he did put her in a position where she could act or not. And I think most of us, I think about, you think about those crossroads in your life that at the time don't seem as momentous as they become later on. When I was deciding to go to seminary, I narrowed it down to two places. Fuller Seminary in California, where I went, and Asbury Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky. And it was Wilmore, Kentucky, Pasadena, California. Wilmore, Kentucky, Pasadena, California. And really, the seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky was more Methodist. But I thought, well, Southern California sounds cool. And so, I went to Pasadena, where I met Janine, who's a native of Pasadena. And, you think, okay, if I had gone to Kentucky instead of California, I never would have met Janine, and how different would my life be, and how we wouldn't have the same children, and they wouldn't have had their spouses, and the 5 grandkids. You start thinking like all those what if, if I'd gone to Kentucky instead of Pasadena. And I can't help but think I was supposed to go to Pasadena, Yeah, she say if you didn't hear what she said, sometimes it's just the right person, it's in your path at the right time, the right relationship, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the prophets had said, the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. The Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. But that girl lived in Nazareth, 70 miles away. So how do you get her to Bethlehem? From a Roman emperor issuing a tax census. And it's the Roman emperor issuing a tax census that forces them to go to Bethlehem, which is where the baby will be born, fulfilling the prophecy that the baby would be born in Bethlehem. Right. Yeah. And you say, okay, how when Augustus is the Roman emperor, and he issues a decree telling everybody to go to their hometown to register for a tax census, does he have any awareness that what he has now done will end up fulfilling a prophecy, a Jewish prophecy? Well, I would say no. He has no clue that that's what he's doing. And yet, that's the way it comes together. That's the way the prophecy is fulfilled. And there's lots of things that you say, all the pieces that had to fall the right way for that to happen. Yeah, like dominoes. Yeah, one of the things, that when I was a philosophy student, getting my MA in philosophy at OU, you'd have these sort of what-if conversations about all kinds of things like that. And, not necessarily religious discussions, but, is this world the best possible world? And, what if the dinosaurs hadn't gotten wiped out? And all those kind of what if kinds of things. And, they say that the meteor that hit the earth that caused the chilling of the atmosphere that killed the dinosaurs, if you're a dinosaur, that's a terrible thing. But for us mammals, it was probably a pretty good thing. So, I don't know, all kinds of what ifs possible. But I do believe that, the little song that we used to sing, he's got the whole world in his hands. I think there's truth in that. I don't think that's it. I don't think that takes away our freedom to choose and our free will. But I do think God, the people who argue about the book of Revelation, well, how's it going to play out, and the rapture and the millennium and the this and the that, and a lot of that I think is way, way overblown. And you say, well, how does the Bible end? Well, God wins. In the end, God wins. However else you want to interpret those things, in the end, God wins. And that's where our hope is. God wins. God wins, love wins, hope wins, grace wins, God wins. Right. Forgets those sins and those things. Yeah. It's right. Yeah, Jesus says the same thing. He says today's got enough things to worry about. You don't need to get all worked up about tomorrow. Such a time as this. Such a time as this. Yeah. And how do you know that the place you are, the people that live close to you, the neighbors you have, the family you have, the job you have, how do you know that you're not there for a reason? That there's a reason you are there? I think there's a reason I'm in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Because again, if we hadn't moved to Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, Patty wouldn't have met her husband, and all kinds of things. There's all kinds of just things happen. Well, I'm going to wrap us up a little bit early, but I'd say what I've decided, since I overestimated how long it would take to get through this book. So a week from today, I'd like for us to take one week to look at the book of Ruth. We're on a Since we're looking at Esther, why not look at Ruth too? Because let's look at Ruth, and then the other 2 weeks, 1 week on Samson and 1 week on Gideon. And I think each of those can really be kind of covered in one session. But I think they're all fascinating stories. So why don't we pray? Lord, we're grateful once again for your providence, your love, your care. Grateful for your protection. Grateful for those times that feel like a coincidence, and yet we know maybe it's more than that. And we just thank you that, like Esther, you've put us for this time in this place, and that you have a plan for us and a mission and a ministry for each of us to fulfill. And we ask that you'd go with us now.